Hello students, welcome to EPG Patasala. I'm Dr. K.R. Ram Mohan, Associate Professor, Head Department of Anthropology, Sikkim University. Today we are going to talk a module on aspects of cognitive anthropology, ethnoscience, ethic, emic, and new ethnography. These concepts are from the paper Theories and Methods in Social Cultural Anthropology. Let us see what are the learning objectives of this module. To understand the concept of cognitive anthropology, to understand the various sub-branches of this topic, and to appreciate the concept critically. Now, what is cognitive anthropology? There are two words here. One is cognition and the other one is anthropology. So cognition is basically a psychology word which studies about the whole thought process, cognition, cognitive. So taking cues from psychological studies of cognition and cognitive processes, cognitive anthropology focuses on the cultural understanding which is encased in words, narratives, and material culture, and how this is grasped and shared with others. It studies the relation of society and human thoughts. For example, how people take the words. If somebody said something to you, how do you take it? In terms of the interpretation of the words, the language, the meanings, the narratives, and even the material culture. What kind of symbol you've been presented? How do you take that as a material culture, as a symbolic to you? What meaning you derive it, and how do you react with that? So in that sense, it primarily, cognitive anthropology primarily believes that understanding of people's classification of the world, which can be natural, social, and cultural world. So how do we categorize this natural world? How do we categorize the social world? People are like this, some people are this, some people are that. So how do we categorize? And how do we categorize the entire society? Is the most important aspect in cognitive anthropological inquiry. So the manner in which the cognitive world of human beings, of individual and people, is constituted and the entire cosmology is being understood by them. So now taking further, we can also say is that cognitive anthropology is closely related with ethnoscience. We can say that how people categorize this immediate world. It could be of anything. So we can say this is ethno. Ethno means ethnic, culture. So ethnoscience. So ethnoscientists focused more on the making of ethnographies more scientific and replicable. If somebody wants to study the same study, it should be replied, gives the same result. About the native's point of the view was basically not a new approach, but it was almost studied as long as by Malinowski in his famous book of Argonauts of the Western Pacific. And he says that one of the main aim of ethnographer is to find out the native classification. So there are four major phases observed in cognitive anthropology. First one is the aims of cognitive anthropology were set involving studies on symbolism, various symbols which represent and occur in a given culture, society, and how these symbols are connected with a linguistic understanding. At one level you have a symbol, at one level you have a language, and how these two things are worked together. For example, Gooden's work on componential study of meanings And then the second aspect is that was initiated an in-depth study of culture, cultural wisdom. What do you mean by cultural wisdom? Cultural wisdom is manifested in stories, in myths, what we call cultural intelligence. Every culture has its own intelligence. It could be literate or it could be non-literate, it could be advanced or it could be no one. So this native intelligence, or which is being manifested in cultural wisdom, and how it can be used is by utilizing methods that have already been in existence. So these studies focused on the psychological theorizing of how natives or how cultures produce this wisdom. And this whole period was between 1950s and 70s. And in the third phase, which is developed by psychologist Eleanor Roche, the link between languages-based units and the prototypes, which are pure psychological units, which is entirely a schema-based theory in psychology. And this, the last phase in cognitive anthropology, is the schema-based theory. How certain categories are produced and stored as schemas in the human mind is the last phase of cognitive anthropology, which has taken heavily from psychology. In this process, there was some subsequential method which has come is called as componential analysis. And the credit goes to Goodenough. Is also called feature analysis, which has borrowed from linguistic anthropology in understanding the domains of language and the attributes of how people categorize particularly kinship systems. So componential analysis is basically to understand kinship categories, kinship systems, language associated schemas. In this process also we have to see that how cognitive or ethnoscience, which has given a new phase of ethnography, what we call new ethnography, which emerged as a critique or a challenge to the existing traditional ethnography, crude ethnography or classical ethnography, questioning basically the methods which we have employed in collecting data in ethnographic studies. So new ethnographic methods, or the scholars which support the idea of new ethnography or ethnoscientific method, argued that there is not any one method in anthropology, and hence scholars should increase the ways of variability in the information provided through the text. So that means anthropologists should come out with more approaches in collecting the data, and this data we are putting in the form of the finished product as a text. So the roots of cognitive anthropology goes back to as long as the Enlightenment period, where foundation of human studies were made. The classical political thinkers like Rousseau, Hobbes, John Locke, and the others have focused interaction of society and human mind. In the modern phase, particularly in anthropological research, we have come across many works of Clifford Geertz, Victor Turner, and Schneider. And these people have moved from finding a more scientific form of inquiry in anthropological research and which has given an inspiration to the linguistic theory of cultures. So in this session, we should also know something about linguistic anthropologists like Kenneth Pike, how language is united with the structure of human behavior. So he wanted to study the sounds that we produced, that is phonetic, and the meaningful units of the sound is phonemic. So please carefully listen. Phonetic, a tick is there, E-T-I-C, and phonemic, a mic is there, E-M-I-C. So there are two concepts evolved from Kenneth Pike's phonetic and phonemic, a tick and emic, which are very important tools in anthropological data collection or anthropological inquiry. So much credit goes to linguistic anthropology in taking how to decipher the meanings out of this. So now we have two words with us, two concepts with us, etic and emic. So through this study at universal level, Kenneth Pike has an idea that things can be observed by an outsider from an etic category, and the meaningful things which gives from the informer, from the emic level. So here one is object, one is the subject. So it is important how the informant is expressing from an emic level. It is not from the etic level, which we should not consider from a pure scientific anthropological data collection. We should also look into Sapir-Whorf's hypothesis, which explains that language is not just only communication, but it has fabricated people's thinking of the world, which taken to the level of culture and language connection. So the methodology, particularly the componential analysis, is to understand the definitive characteristics where we can take the artifacts, the material things, and the ideas stored or sorted in each domain by the respective natives, what we call the indigenous conceptual categories. How do they categorize? And why do they categorize in such way? Colors, numbers, systems, cosmology from a native indigenous point of view. So these scholars believed that components of these cognitive domains, when organized one of the several logical possibilities, can be more accurate, systematic and replicable instead of doing haphazardly. So it is the duty of the researcher to understand and to take whatever, how they categorized all these objects and schemes. So an elemental conception of ethnoscience and early cognitive anthropology was that peoples categorized objects. Say for example, one culture has categorized the objectives in this way. These are the objectives used for these objectives used for that, these objectives used for that, these plants are for that, these plants for these plants for this. There is a complete categorization of all these artifacts and words and symbols and language. So one has to look at the psychological list. How did they categorize? And why people refer as to these schemas, which earlier we call as a prototype and later we call as cognitive schemas. Now, taking these two classical concepts, today we call it as connectionism. So what is this connectionism? where intellect is connected, that means the thought, the cognition, and the elements surrounded by the neurons at a biological level, where the information is collected, processed, and analyzed at a neurological level. Conklin basically has been much referred even in ecological anthropology, which is how people's categorizations. We also see Conklin's work in cognitive anthropology has explored the color classification among Hanunu, where Conklin wants to include answers in linguistic form after showing some of the painted cards and other colored materials. This has resulted that cognition of native in terms of color categories were large number overlapping were found, which cannot be remedified and controlled specimens. So Conklin found large and more common understanding people about color cognition, whether having 4 colors of color system, or there could be subpanels includes hundreds of colors which could be overlapping. That means how a particular culture categorizes or recognizes colors in the nature. If, according to Conklin's ethnographic studies, these society could not give more number of color subcategories because the cognitive structure limits the individual to express in a linguistic form. So like that, many of the findings focused a contrast between a broader color categories like lightness, darkness, color shades, dryness, wetness related to surroundings of the local flora of was very important to understand this classification of colors, thought process, and language. Now, this categorization also included in terms of food and raw products. Both are named with extensions of terms used such as uncooked, fresh, vegetables, fruits with the local native terms. Conklin's analysis is very interesting in a sense that these all comes under vegetables. But each among these vegetables, you have a category of schema that these vegetables can be cooked, these vegetables can be eaten raw, these vegetables are not to be eaten, these vegetables are not for this, these vegetables are sour, these vegetables are sweet, these vegetables are in size. How do they categorize all these things? So this analogy we can say to even fruits in terms of colors, in terms of shapes, in terms of taste, and they give names according to these kinds of categories. So like that, in the community where the social relevance of the artifacts, see every artifact has a meaning and social relevance, is based on the color categories again, and how the manufactured goods, like these things are darker, these things are lighter, these things are heavy, these things are not heavy, these things are liftable, and these things are decorative, these things are not decorative. So how people classify and how people categorize artifacts based on certain things on their cognition, which is culturally rooted, which is interested in ethnoscience. With this, we can also come to a model, or what we call a cultural model or a folk model of cognitive aspects. Now, this refers to the inattentive set of speculation and perception of the members of social group. So how people perceive the entire world and their behavior. So these cultural models can be both overtly and inattentively learned and are based in the knowledge cognized from other members of the society as well as personal experiences of the society. If one individual has one experience with one object, he shares with other members of the society. That it becomes a pool of knowledge. So most of the times, these cultural models are linked to the emotional reactions, as I said now, of some experience, and people take their suppositions and aspects in general or normal. One member reports he has an experience with one object or with one plant or with one animal or with one object in the nature, though it is personal, and if he shares with other members, that kind of an experience becomes general and normal. So we have also how certain categories at a personal level, that the roles played by a woman as a mother, as a sister, as a wife, as a friend, and what kind of expectations people do in these kinds of behavior is also given as some kind of schematic categories. So folk models, classification, and knowledge structure are deeply embedded things in the native patterns, their practices, and understanding is given importance where folk model is connected to the domain of different spheres. So cultural phenomena in one domain can be linked to other. For example, in the Indian context, in the level of ideology, Sita, wife of Rama, is considered to be as a perfect wife, which can find a place in real life of Indian women's world. So this is an ideal which has come into a cultural realm. Now folk classification tries to find the base of these classifications, that how people categorize these things. So hence, knowledge construction, which goes beyond analysis of folk classification, serious attempts are made in understanding cognition, knowledge, and their classification. So we can come to some critical understanding of cognitive anthropology in terms that cognitive anthropology attempts to make ethnography more scientific, leading to formulation of certain methods and methodology. But Keesing criticized the incapability of cognitive scientists in their study to various domains. He was under the impression that can you study all the cognitive aspects of individuals? So whether cognitive studies were not having any scope or cross-cultural analysis, and how can you make generalizations? The cosmology or analysis of these studies conducted were also being criticized as they are being static and synchronic. Now, one also questions that whether these are fixed or changing, or they are static. Now, Malinowski also asked whether how can we reach natives classification unless the natives come out with their own explanation. But as an outsider, but as an observer, it is really difficult to understand the other's cognitive schema. To summary, there are 4 or 5 concepts have emerged in this module. One is cognitive anthropology. The other one is new ethnography. And there are 2 important topics themes which are developed in this module is emic and etic approach in understanding people of their cultures, and cultural and folk model in classifying, in codifying, in understanding native classification of nature, of plants, of animals, cosmologies. And we also understood some of the studies conducted by psychologists, how natives classify colors, how natives combine both language and culture. In that, we also understood Sapir-Whorf's hypothesis that language has an intrinsic value and connected to culture. So with these concepts, we have a new insight in conducting anthropological inquiry in the form of new ethnography.